Hi, and welcome to my FlossTube channel. I'm Jean Farish, and I am so glad that you're here with me today. We're going to talk about a few things that we started discussing last week about needles and French knots and substitutes for French knots and all that kind of good stuff. But I thought I would start with a little bit of update about some things that I am stitching and some things that I'm designing. So, of course, I'm continuing to stitch on Jane Hattersley. And we have a Zoom gathering planned for tonight. Last time I checked, there was still room for a couple more people. And so I will put that information in the episode description again, so you have an idea about how to go about that. And basically, what we're trying here is using Eventbrite, which is a free thing that you can get tickets for online events. Churches use it, organizations use it, and when there is no charge or fee for the event, as there will not be a charge for the Zoom gathering tonight, then of course there's no charge through Eventbrite, so it's completely free to use. So kind of excited about that. This is kind of a test run, so we'll see how it's working with using Eventbrite. Fingers crossed it's going to work smoothly, because I really like the idea of there being a way to kind of register and let me know that you're planning on attending, and so that you know that you have a place. I don't like the idea of people logging on at the time that an event is supposed to start and find out that there isn't space for them. So this way you'll know ahead of time. So that's kind of nice. So I'm really hoping that that's going to work out with Eventbrite. So if it goes smoothly, look for more. So that's kind of exciting. Now, as far as Roxie is concerned, I am stitching, of course, ahead of everybody, doing part 3 right now, which is introducing the rice stitch and the Algerian eyelet stitch to the group. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. I kind of, there's part of me that it's like I don't want to really show anybody what the next part is until the people who are participating get a glimpse of it. So after May 1st, I'll show you what we're doing for the third part. But what I did think I would do tonight is talk a little bit about slubs, because one of them, I think, is going to interfere with my eyelet stitches. So let me show you what I'm talking about here. So when I noticed the slub, I put one of my kind of little stitches there to remind myself to look at it. But let me come in a little bit closer if I can. And I think you can see, pardon me, getting all choked up here. I think that you can see where a really fine stitch like an eyelet, depending on where the stitch lies, this kind of a slub can be a problem. So what can we do when we've got this type of a slub? And what I want to caution you to do is, whatever you're doing, take tiny little steps, be very, very cautious, and don't try to do anything really extreme, because a slub is actually part of the weave. So it's not like if you take the slub out completely, you can end up with a hole. So you certainly don't want that. So that's why I'm saying go very slowly, take tiny little steps. So I'm, obviously I haven't pre-done this, so here I am doing it on camera. So we'll see what happens with this particular situation. So the first thing I want to do, and I need to move it over here so I can see it a little bit better, is I just want to kind of take a look at what's going on with the slub. And this is kind of the heaviest part right here. So I'm going to pull on it just a little bit. And it's important to use a tapestry needle. Can you see how as I'm pulling this away, you can see that there's still a lot of thread left underneath of it. Okay, so at this point, let me grab my scissors. So basically all I'm planning on using is a pair of really good embroidery scissors and my needle. Now I'm going to cut off that excess and dig around a little bit more. I think I'm going to go next to where that slub was. Okay, so underneath this, I'm still seeing a fairly thick thread. And I think I'm also going to okay, now to me that's already looking better. Let's see if I can thin it out just a little bit right here also. Of course, if I end up cutting or ruining my weave, it'll give me an opportunity to teach you how you can go in and repair that type of a hole, but I really don't want to, not tonight anyway. So that's already looking better to me, and I feel like that it's diminished enough that it's going to make my little eyelet stitch okay. I hope that now that doesn't get rid of it entirely. You still certainly have a thicker thread there, and frankly, if I had not started stitching this yet, if I were if I had found it before I started doing any of the stitching, probably would be a little bit more aggressive. So one of the things I do try to do when I start a new piece is take a minute and really look at the piece of linen and see if there are any kind of troublemakers lurking, and so that I can go ahead and address it before I start stitching. At this point, I have so much time invested in this. And of course, the whole idea of taping the video lessons for the people who are doing Roxie are so time critical that I don't have time for a disaster right now. So that's why I'm being a little bit more cautious. So in the coming weeks, I want to talk a little bit more about how to get rid of slubs. But as I said, the first thing is to really look at your piece of linen ahead of time and see whether or not there's anything that's going to need to get fixed before you start stitching. So that's the first thing. Second thing is tiny little steps. Be very, very cautious. Do not try to do anything drastic. And remember that if you get rid of the entire slub, you're going to end up with a hole, because that slub is part of the weave of the linen. And basically where they happen, from my somewhat limited understanding of the whole weaving process, is where two linen threads have been overlapped and to make one very continuous thread. There's some really good videos on YouTube about growing and harvesting and spinning and weaving linen, and I really encourage you to look at one of them. If I have time, I'll include a link in the episode description so you can get an idea. I have two in mind that I've watched a couple of times that I think are kind of interesting, and it really helps you understand how linen is so different from spinning and weaving silk, from spinning and weaving cotton, and why the slubs just become a very intrinsic part of what linen is like. So anyway, so that's my where I am. Excuse me. That's where I am with Roxie. Really excited about this. And like I say, this the 2 stitches that are coming up in part 3 are the rice stitch and the Algerian eyelet. It's just also time to remind you that if you have not started Roxie, if you haven't joined us yet and you are thinking about it, think fast, because as of May 15th, I'm cutting off adding any new people to this group. And now when we're all done, which will be what, June, like in the fall, probably after I get back from the Great Parks trip, that's when I will put the whole thing together, and you'll be able to get the whole chart, not as a stitch along, but just as a completed chart. And of course, the videos will still be available to the people who purchase the chart. So that's what's going on with Roxie. Now, for Great Parks, I'm really excited about the sampler that I am designing. And what I decided is I have found myself creating a series, which was kind of unintended. I'm calling it the ampersand series of samplers. And if you're not familiar with that term, an ampersand is simply that and sign that we use all the time. Sometimes we make it like a plus, and sometimes it's fancier, almost like a musical sign, a clef, I guess. Anyway, that's what an ampersand is. And so the first one that I did was, yes, I can think of this, the hare in the basket. Then I did the deer and the grapes. And then I did the bear. Oh my gosh, this is like forgetting your own children's names. The bear and the moose. There you go. So I decided to continue that. And this one's going to be the bison and the elk. And it will be to commemorate the trip that we're taking starting in Arizona, Utah, and Colorado. And this is in middle to late September this year. And there's a group of us. I think we're capping out the group at 40. And last I checked, there were less than a dozen spots left. So if you're thinking about joining us on that trip, again, don't hesitate. And again, I will put the information out about how to get the details and how to register. And basically, this is a trip that I get to come as a guest teacher. I'm not organizing the trip. So I will refer all inquiries to Ray at RGE Travels. Anyway, so let me show you what that one's going to look like. Now, this is definitely what I'm calling a design in progress, which the acronym would be DIP for DIP, which doesn't really impress me any. So let's instead just refer to it what it is, and that's kind of something that's on my drawing board. But this is the progress that I've made so far. So this is just a paper mock-up. Of course, it's not going to be this small of the design. And these are the colors that I have chosen. And I tried to get the sense of the big sky and the ochre colors and all the beautiful landmarks, and of course the turquoise that we see in so much of the whole cultural decor of the Native Americans of the area, and a little bit of gold, and certainly some greens for all the trees and whatnot, we're going to say. Anyway, so these are the colors that I chose, and the design is, I haven't been to this part of the world to explore the cultures and the great parks firsthand. So I had to rely on good old research. And so I kind of studied the design elements that you see in so much of the Native American art. And of course, did research about what flora and fauna we would see. And then, of course, included just some good traditional sampler motifs. And so the quote that I picked is one from Teddy Roosevelt: "Keep your eyes on the stars and your feet on the ground." And I decided to use Roosevelt's quote because, you know, he certainly is the president that started the whole conservation movement and has protected all of these amazing, amazing landmarks for posterity so that we can all enjoy them. And then I just put in the American Southwest, and there'll be a place for your name, of course. Now, there's still some blank area here, still a work in progress. I haven't started stitching this one yet because I still have a few things that I need to work on. And this is that little ampersand thing I was talking about. So, yeah, so that's the bison and the elk that's coming up. And I love the stage that I'm in because, you know, it's a toss-up. Do I love designing more than stitching? Do I like designing and stitching more than teaching? And to me, they're kind of a three-legged stool. I would not be able to say there's just one of the three that I enjoy the most. But I'm looking forward in the coming weeks. I'm going to have a lot of stitching ahead of me because I've got the bison and the elk to do. And I have a new design that's going to be for the Work of the Hands retreat that happens the weekend before I head out west to go to the Great Parks. And this is a retreat that I started with Terry Bay, oh golly, 5 or 6 years ago. And we've done it every year except, of course, last year. And fingers crossed, everything's going to be fine to do it in September this year. This is a very different retreat because it's limited to 16 people. It's an all-inclusive weekend. We go out to really nice restaurants, nothing fancy, but just good food, locally owned, locally sourced restaurants. And they're just the places that I like to go and hang out and eat with my family and friends. And so when this group comes to town, then I get to take them to my favorite restaurants. We also spend an afternoon at Mesda, which is a museum of early Southern decorative arts, studying their samplers. And then, of course, there are classes. Terry teaches one all-day class. I teach another all-day class. And then the second day, we switch. So all students get to take both all-day classes with both of us. And Terry's project is a combination of black work and some white work. And mine this year is going to be some pulled thread work and some stump work. So if you're new to stump work, it's basically adding a third dimension to your needlework. So things are not just all flat. A petal may be detached and then reattached to the fabric. I'm probably not explaining it very thoroughly, but it's a fascinating aspect of needlework. And so I'm applying it to this design. So let me show you what I have so far. I'm not ready to reveal all of it, but what I'm going to have is this very spring, summery trellis of roses across the top. And then the alphabet is in this really sweet pale blue that's going to kind of mimic the sense of like a early summer sky. And then underneath of that, there's going to be a honeycomb and a bee keep and some little tiny bees buzzing around. Yeah, I'm gonna, picture's worth 1,000 words. So I'm gonna show you what's going on with this as I'm designing it, because I thought that would be kind of fun to kind of give you kind of a behind the scenes. This is how I go about designing things. But I did want to share with you the verse that's going to go on this, and this is from Proverbs. Gracious words are a honeycomb, sweet to the soul and healing to the bones. And that just really spoke to me of how, I just feel like that as a, not just an American society, but it just seems like a worldwide society, that we're entering into this period of healing, and that graciousness is just going to take us so far through this process. And so it just really jumped out at me. And so that's why I decided the whole bees and honeycomb and whatnot, it's just sort of a theme. So I'll share this with you as I'm going along, and you'll see it develop. So yeah, so I've got, as you see, this one, I couldn't wait to start stitching it. I have on order some Valdani dye, variegated pearl cotton that I want to use for the pulled thread work. I usually use a thread that matches my ground cloth for pulled thread, but I really want that sort of honey color coming through with the honeycomb stitch. And yeah, so we'll see. And you know what, quite honestly, sometimes what I see in my mind, and even when I get sketched on paper, doesn't translate with needle and thread on fabric. And so there are times that I just have to rip out and back up and say, okay, that didn't work, I'll try something else. But yeah, so that's what's going on with this one. So so I've got Roxie and Jane well underway. I've got the bison and the elk almost ready to start stitching, and I've got Gracious Words that I'm stitching now. And so I'm gonna have got 4 balls in the air, and this frankly is very unusual for me to have so many things stitching at the same time. So we'll see how I do with that. Oh, before I have a lot of interesting questions that came across my desk this week, a lot of them based on last week's episode. But before I get into that, I also want to share with you this wonderful Weathervane horse that was stitched by someone who bought it from my Etsy store. So this is what it looks like. And I should also show you what mine look like, so you can kind of get an idea of how different this one looks. I am so excited about it. And this is by a stitcher by the name of Tommy Jane. And she said, she just sent me a note through Etsy and said, I thought I would show you my Weathervane horse I just finished. I used 40 count Weeks Aztec red linen. I love this. She stitched it on red linen. I sewed on the miter borders and mounted on acid-free foam core board. Thank you for this timeless, beautiful design. And you know what? I may have charted it, but honestly, it's when you choose these incredible colors of this vibrant ground cloth, and then I don't know what color she used for the stitching. I will send her a note and ask her. But she got this reversed image by using the light color on a darker fabric. And I absolutely love this. And I love the way she mounted it using kind of a quilting technique, I guess. I mean, adding fabric and then mounting the whole thing on acid-free foam board. So just gives you another alternative and another way to finish things as well. So, man, I really appreciate her sending me that image. Okay, so the questions we got this week. We had 2 hot topics, knots and needles. So first, needles. So P. Nickel, I'd like to think that her first name is Penny, but it probably isn't. I have only used the tapestry needles produced by that company, the one that I would not name last week, because they're the only brand offered in our stores. Could you elaborate a bit and explain exactly what someone should look for in a high quality needle? Okay, I think the way to know what is a high quality needle, unfortunately, is to just use them. Again, the company name I will not say has a very, very high reputation, and it is a name, it's a brand that everyone knows. And yet their needles are terrible. I mean, I wouldn't stitch with them. And how do I know that? Because I have stitched with them. I mean, I'm not relying on what somebody else has told me. I don't like stitching with them. And mainly it's because the eye, it's so poorly made that what happens if the needle is made by a stamping process, if somebody is stamping out the needle, then what happens is the eye has a right and wrong side. One side is smooth, the other side is rough. And so you will often hear people say, well, if you have trouble threading your needle, turn it around and thread it the other direction. My response to that is, if you have that kind of trouble threading that needle and you have to turn it halfway around to be able to thread it, toss that needle and get a better one. If you're someplace and it's the only needle you have, then yeah, of course you're going to have to use it. But that would be evidence to me to say, check that brand off my list. I'm not buying any more of those needles. Of all the things that we put into our needlework, the needle is the least expensive, and yet it's the most important, and it's one of the ones that we tend to ignore. So don't stitch with an inferior needle. And if you're one of the people that's lucky enough to have a local needlework store, or when you're shopping online, if your means allow you to do this, buy several different brand needles and make sure that wherever you put them around your stitching stuff, that you know which needle is from which brand, and then stitch with them and draw your own conclusions as far as if you see a difference in the ease of using them, the ease of threading them, the ease of stitching with them. But no, if you have to turn your needle in order to thread it, that is not a good needle. The other sign is that when the eye of the needle is not manufactured smoothly, then that rough eye of the needle will also eventually cut your thread. So if you find your thread fraying as it's passing through the eye of your needle, again, that's an indicator that that is not a good quality needle. So again, toss it when you can, and tell yourself you're not buying that brand anymore. The other thing is the finish of the needle. Now, this becomes a very personal thing, because there are people who, through their own body chemistry, they tend to wear the finish off needles faster than other people. I personally don't have that problem, so I don't know how to respond as far as whether we're talking about days or weeks or months or hours as far as the finish coming off. But again, if that is something that happens, okay, first of all, let me be clear. If it happens with some needles and not others, then again, check that needle goes off my list. Now, if you're a person who, because of their body chemistry, wears the finish off all needles, then obviously that's not a factor that you can apply as far as determining whether or not that is a good needle or not. But again, if you are using brand A and brand B, and A, the finish comes right off, and B, it doesn't, then A gets tossed. So it's the finish, it's the eye of the needle, and I'm sure that, yeah, I think I'm going to do? I'm going to reach out to these various needle manufacturers and ask them to respond to that question. What makes a good needle? And report back to you, tell you what they tell me. Maureen sent in a really good question. She said, can you just explain what the numbers mean? Is a size 24 needle thicker than a 26 or 28, or is the number referring to the size of the eye? And if it's referring to the size of the eye, does that mean a 26 is narrower than a 24? And the answer to that question is yes and yes. So it's the length of the needle, it's the thickness of the shank of the needle, and it's the size of the eye. All of them are smaller in a finer needle. And the finer the needle, the higher the number. So I pulled needles out of my stash to show you the full range of the sizes I use anyway, both in my personal stitching and for teaching. So this largest one is a size 20, 22, a 24, 26, and a 28. So you can see where when you've got two needles that are right next to each other in terms of scale, it's kind of hard to tell them apart. But when you look at them from the extreme of, say, a 28 to a 20, then it does become much more apparent. Yeah, so that's, and these are, can't remember now, these are not all John James. Two of them are Krynic, and I don't remember which ones are the Krynic ones. So, and that's another good brand of needle to use. So, yeah, so that's, that kind of explains the whole thing with size. Well, and then Dawn sent in a question that, you know, puts me in the hot seat again, which I don't mind being here. Okay, so she said, I keep hearing that you should be using a new needle for each project. Do you subscribe to that practice? And then she goes on to say that her favorite needle is a ball tip needle, and she likes it a lot, but they are fairly expensive, and so she's, you know, understandably hesitant to just dump one with each new project. So no, I don't subscribe to that theory, and for a couple of reasons. First of all, when you say using a new needle for each new project, are we talking about a project like my America Land That We Love that I spent, well, I should not have needed to have spent 4 years stitching it, but I did spend 4 years stitching it. Or is it a little Christmas ornament? So to say that you need a new needle with each new project, well, first of all, that all depends on the size of the project. But more than that, and maybe sometimes I have too much of a sense of history and connection with women who, and men who stitched in the past. But there was a time when a needle was an incredibly precious possession, and you did not lose it. You did not toss it because you started a new project. And I find it hard to believe that in this day and age that needles are manufactured to less of a standard than they were 200 years ago. So that's part of the logic that I'm using here. That I say to myself, why in 2021 am I throwing out a perfectly good needle when in 1821 my stitching sister would have never done that? Now, when do I reach for a new needle? Well, probably the thing that happens the most often is I lose them. And when I have noticed that one has gone missing, trust me, I spend a lot of time looking, because we do have a four-footed member of our family, and I just hesitate to think that if Oliver got one of these needles in his paw, it would just break my heart. And I'm sure any of you that have cats or dogs, or certainly small children at home, need to be especially careful that if you don't know where your needle is, then you find it before you do anything else. So frankly, it's rare that I can't find it at all. I will get down on my hands and knees, I will get a flashlight, I will get a magnet, and I will find that needle. More often though, I find that I end up breaking the eye of the needle. And part of this is because I do pulled thread work, and pulled thread work is harder on the eye of the needle than say your just regular cross stitch. But usually it's one of those two things that's going to happen that will require me to toss that needle and get a new one. And of course, I don't, I keep needles with my projects. So if, the needle that I'm using for Stitch Roxie stays with Roxie, and then I have a different needle for Jane. So there's that. And so I don't, it would be really interesting to track how long I actually stitch with a particular needle. But it seems like to me, it's a long time, like months, maybe even longer than that, before I would toss that needle and need to get another one. So that's, again, if you feel strongly that each time you start a new project, you should have a new needle, then that's what you should do. But if you are doing it because that's what everybody says you should do, then I would say take a deep breath and ask yourself if that's really the case. And I also have to wonder, maybe the people that say that is because they're not using good quality needles. I don't know. Try using a really good needle and see if you don't see that it makes a difference. So anyway, that's a lot of talk about such a little teeny thing. But it, of course, is, it's the universal tool that we all have to use for our craft. Okay, one of the other questions I got this week was about when I was demonstrating using beads in place of French knots or colonial knots. And the question was whether or not that bead should be stitched over one or over two. And again, we're talking about if you're stitching on linen or even weave. And my response to that is it all depends. Is the bead replacing a French knot? In which case it should be covering one intersection of your linen or your even weave. If it's replacing a cross stitch and everything else in that design has been stitched over two, then yes, you would stitch it over two. So there's the distinction. What I was showing you last week was how to use a bead in place of a French knot, not in place of a cross stitch. So I do want to make that distinction. Oh, I also had an aha moment last week. I didn't realize this, but when I give you time codes now, as far as where each new topic comes up, those are actually active or live links, and that when you are looking at the episode description, you can actually click on it and it will take you to that part. So if you are looking for something that you've watched and you want to rewatch it, that's a good thing to do. And eventually I am going back and creating time codes for the episodes that I made before I started doing this. So look for that little improvement as well. So R. Williams sent this, and I don't know what the R stands for, but she said, or he, so you don't use beeswax on your thread, just water. And my response to that is, that's right. Beeswax to me is unnecessary in standard cross stitch. It will darken colors over time. And this is another modern day myth that is out there all over the place about how beeswax and thread magic or other brand things will help improve your stitching. And I just don't find that to be true. Now, beeswax in particular is helpful for strengthening sewing thread if you're going to do something like, say, sew on a button. And I've used that example before, but it's the best one I can think of because I do remember that from home ec, that if you are stitching a button on a coat, then coating the thread with beeswax strengthens it and will allow that button to stay in place longer. But I also feel strongly that if floss companies felt that their product needed an after purchase application. I think that they would fix the problem and not just pass it on to us. So my question becomes, what is it about our cotton floss that makes us think we need to add something to it? Now, if it's because it's knotting and tangling, I don't find that's because it's cotton floss. I find that's because the floss is twisted, especially if you wrap your floss on bobbins, it's going to get a zigzaggy kink in it. And even keeping my floss as I do on thread drops, where I've attached it to the thread drop, that is going to be kind of curly. And so I just use the wet sponge technique to, like, you know, go down the length of the thread with it, straighten it out, and stitch with it, and I'm fine. So again, that's another thing that I think just keeps getting shared with beginners in particular, and I just don't find it to be necessarily true. Now, those little beeswax things that people make in molds and what, they're really cute, and I can see where they would have a big appeal to say, oh, that's lovely, I would love to have one, and it smells good if it's real beeswax. But it doesn't, to me, does not belong in our counter cross stitch. Now, I did use, I've used beeswax in doing something like gold work. It's absolutely essential. But it's just, you know, no, I just don't see the need for it in regular counter cross stitch. And finally, I got this question from Robin. She said, thank you so much for this clear explanation of knots. Technical question. I use a loop method to start, and sometimes, although not always, find that I end up with one end shorter than the other, occasionally by as much as an inch. Is this because I'm stitching unevenly, or is it purely a matter of one strand traveling further around the bends than the other? My stitches are pretty even as a rule. Well, I used to think that the unevenness at the end of a floss run indicated that I was doing something wrong. So for a while, I paid a lot of attention to making sure that the two strands were exactly even when I started, and making sure I was keeping every stitch parallel to each other. And when I got to the end, I, again, was at, you know, as much as an inch difference between the two strands. And I know I started with both of them being even. So to me, this is one of the great mysteries of life. And it may be very true that basically as the stitches are going around the bend, so to speak, that it's, you know, using up floss more on one strand than the other. So basically, I quit worrying about it, and I suggest that you do too. So as long as your tension is good and even and your stitches are parallel to each other, if it ends up being uneven when you get to the end of the strand of floss, don't worry about it. So they were some really great questions I got this week, and as always, I love hearing from you. I love getting feedback, and I love the questions that you ask. There's always room for questions, and I hope that you don't ever hesitate or think that a question's too silly or whatever. I've been saying this my whole teaching life. There is no such thing as a dumb question. There are simply unasked questions. So please do let me know what's on your mind and what I need to clarify, especially. So that brings us to the end of this week's episode, and I have enjoyed it. I hope you have too. I hope that you stitch happy and stay safe. I'll see you next week.